A Toronto lawyer died in 1926 and left his entire fortune to whichever woman in the city produced the most children in the 10 years after his death. It was not a joke, it was a valid will, it survived every attempt to overturn it, and it set off a decade-long race that the newspapers called the Stork Derby. This is Quilled history, the stories the textbooks quietly left out. So why would anyone write a clause like that? How does a will that reads like a prank survive the courts of a very conservative country for 10 years? And what happened to the women who actually entered in the middle of the worst economic decade of the century? The man who wrote it was a wealthy Toronto barrister, a bachelor with no close family, and by every account an extremely accomplished practical joker. His hobby was setting traps that revealed how people behaved around money, and he had spent his career watching exactly that. His party trick was leaving money on the pavement and watching respectable people glance around before pocketing it. His will was the same experiment written at scale and set to run after his death, and the opening line says so almost explicitly. It describes itself as unusual and explains that this is because he has no dependents and no need for the usual arrangements. The other clauses set the tone. He left shares in a brewery to a group of Protestant ministers who publicly opposed alcohol, and shares in a racetrack to men who had campaigned against gambling, in both cases only if they accepted and participated. Several of them thought about it, and several accepted. He also left $1 each to a long list of named acquaintances, and a share of a jockey club to two men who had spent years denouncing horse racing from pulpits. The pattern is consistent throughout. The bequest is always trivially easy to accept and quietly humiliating to keep. He left a holiday home in Jamaica, jointly to 3 lawyers who were known to detest each other. And then, at the end, the residue clause. Whatever remained after 10 years was to go to the mother who had given birth to the greatest number of children in Toronto in that decade. The estate would have been modest, except for one thing. Among his holdings were shares connected to a tunnel project between Detroit and Windsor, and after his death, that investment rose sharply. The fortune the contest was competing for grew to something around $500,000, which in the 1930s was an enormous sum. Then the timing did the rest. Miller died in 1926. The stock market collapsed in 1929, and the decade that followed was the Great Depression. A contest that might have looked like a curiosity in a prosperous year became, for families with nothing, a genuine and serious prospect. The women who competed were, almost without exception, poor. Several families were on relief. Several husbands were out of work. The prize represented something none of them could reach any other way, and the price of entry was a decade of continuous childbearing under the worst possible conditions. The competitors themselves were tracked publicly throughout. Newspapers printed running tallies, as though it were a sporting league table, and reporters visited the houses. Women gave interviews standing in doorways with children on their hips, and the coverage was framed as entertainment for the whole decade. There was also a strand of public commentary treating the whole thing as evidence of the moral failings of the poor, which is a remarkable position to take about a contest designed and funded entirely by a wealthy lawyer and validated by the courts of the province. The city took it seriously enough to argue about it for years. The Ontario government tried to have the clause struck down as contrary to public policy and immoral, and to seize the estate for the province, which is a motive worth noticing while reading the moral objections. Distant relatives appeared and challenged it too. The case went up through the courts and eventually to the highest court available, and the will was upheld at every stage. The reasoning was consistent and unglamorous. The clause was clear, it was not illegal, and a man may dispose of his property as he wishes even if the result is undignified. So the contest ran to its end in October 1936, and then the arguing started properly, because the wording had a gap in it. It said children, and it did not define which children counted. That single omission produced the most revealing part of the whole affair. Did stillbirths count? Did children who had since died count? The registration system recorded births, so a stillborn child appeared in the register alongside a living one. Women who had lost children found themselves arguing in open court that those children should be counted in front of newspapers. And there was a harder question underneath. 2 of the strongest contenders had children by more than one father, or were not married to the fathers. and the court had to decide whether children born outside marriage counted toward the total. In 1930s Ontario, that was not treated as a technicality. The press covered all of it in detail, with names, addresses, and photographs. Women who had entered a contest for money were now public figures whose private lives were being examined in print, and the coverage ranged from sympathetic to openly contemptuous depending on the paper. In 1938, the courts settled it. 4 women were declared joint winners, each having had 9 children in the 10-year period that counted under the ruling, and the estate was divided between them. Each received roughly $125,000. 2 other women received settlements outside the main award. One had 11 children, but several were stillborn or born outside marriage, and rather than continue litigating, the estate paid her a smaller sum. Another accepted a similar arrangement. They were paid to stop arguing, which is its own kind of verdict. What the money did is the part worth sitting with. In the middle of the Depression, $125,000 was transformative. The winners bought houses, cleared debts, put children through school, and in at least one case funded a family business. By any measure, that improved those lives enormously. And the cost is equally real. These were women who bore 9 or more children in 10 years, in poverty, without reliable medical care, because a dead man had made it worth their while. The health consequences of that are not hypothetical, and several of the families involved were also grieving children who had not survived. Which brings us back to what the will actually was. It has always been told as an eccentric joke, and the man who wrote it certainly intended a joke. But the joke was aimed at a specific target, and it was not the women. He had spent a career watching temperance ministers, anti-gambling campaigners, lawyers and courts behave one way in public and another when money was involved. Every clause in that will was a test of whether a particular kind of respectable person would take money that embarrassed them, and almost all of them did. The province argued the clause was immoral while trying to take the money. The relatives argued he was of unsound mind while claiming under the same document. The courts declined to save anyone from the consequences of a clearly worded sentence. He had predicted the behavior of every one of them, and he was dead the whole time. What he does not seem to have predicted, or perhaps did not weigh, is that the people who would actually pay the cost of the joke were poor women, and that the decade the clause ran through would be the hungriest in living memory. The satire was aimed upward, and the weight of it landed somewhere else entirely. The law that followed is the quiet postscript. Ontario later changed its rules so that a will could not create a contest of this kind, and the case is still taught in law schools as the standard example of the limits of testamentary freedom and what happens when a document is clear enough to be enforced, but strange enough that nobody wants to. So the man got exactly what he wanted. He is remembered, his joke worked, every institution he aimed at behaved precisely as he expected, and the story is still funny in outline. It is only when you go looking for the names of the 4 women, and count the children, and check the year, that the humor thins out. One forgotten story every week. Subscribe and catch our next video.